Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to be talking about a lot of different topics over the next couple of hours, although there is a theme that sort of runs through our national programs, which run from 1 to 3 o'clock Central Time, and that is we're going to be talking about redeeming capitalism at the 1 o'clock hour with Kenneth Barnes, and we're going to really get into the whole issue of ethics and how economics and ethics fit together, and then we're going to really be talking about Christian ethics with Wayne Grudem in that last hour. So those topics do sort of come together, but this is our first hour, which is one that is heard just on some of the local stations. We wanted to focus on a couple of other stories, and one of those that I wanted to focus on might for a minute seem a little bit out of the ordinary, because I want to talk about all the shootings and the killings in Chicago. Now, I do it for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a human tragedy that, frankly, is not being covered and should be. We on this program many times talk about some of the tragedies that take place in terms of the persecution of Christians, or Muslim violence against Christians, or just the circumstance of religious liberty in other countries around the world. And so those are certainly important issues that we want to address. And we sometimes feel the need to, because the press is not covering it. And that brings us to the other reason I want to cover it, and that is just the need for you to have a level of discernment about what you see, read, and hear. This story that came out last night kind of got my attention, that at that time they had 40 people that were shot just in Sunday alone in Chicago. The total at that time, and it's exceeded that, but I'll just use the numbers in this particular article by Timothy Meads. Just the number of people shot this weekend in Chicago, 59 with 10 fatalities. Now, the point I'm bringing this up is because that doesn't sort of fit the journalistic meme, the journalistic narrative, or whatever it might be. It really isn't getting covered. You know, if you had 50 plus people, almost 60 people, well, it is now more than 60 people that were shot over the weekend at a school, you know what you would hear. I mean, it would be front page. It would be the lead story everywhere. If that was done by somebody who is a white supremacist, you know we wouldn't hear the end of it for weeks. But because this is, if you will, basically gang warfare, and sadly, we're at a situation right now where it almost happens so regularly that it's almost not news, all these killings that are taking place. This story really didn't get much coverage. So I started paying attention. And I'll give half credit to Channel 8 News, WFAA, which is the ABC affiliate. Their second to the last story did a 10-second read on this. So at least it acknowledged it. But again, just imagine this is something that was reported by ABC 7 in Chicago. You would think that all the ABC affiliates would have picked it up. And that's maybe the only reason that Channel 8 had it, because it was up on the wire. It was something we read. And so they did mention it, I think, just before they went to the sports. And that was it, you know. So at least there was an acknowledgement of that. But it's just a reminder again of what life is like sometimes in the inner city. Let me just read a couple of paragraphs to give you a sense. Chicago Police Department reports at least 40 people have been shot today in the city in what appears to be a barrage of gang-related activities. Total number shot at that point was 59 with 10 fatalities. Later reported that the police said a group of people, 3 teens, 5 adults, were standing in a courtyard in which some of the shots rang out. There, again, is something that is even more significant as you work your way down. Are you ready for this number? More than 4,000 people were shot in Chicago in 2016. This led President Donald Trump to declare that he would send the federal government to fix the problem. And, of course, there are those who are in Chicago right now that are some saying, I saw one the other day saying, we welcome the president in involvement. Others saying, president, stay out. There's some that are asking for the mayor to resign, and others that are just saying, no, we don't need Donald Trump to make matters worse. So, again, even in the midst of what is an incredible human tragedy, 4,000 people shot in Chicago. And just, again, ask yourself, even tonight, how many times that shows up in the news. Now, again, I'll give credit. I think some of the mainstream media, because it was so extreme this weekend, will have to cover it a little bit on their Monday broadcast. We'll pay attention to that and see. But all of that to also emphasize something else. And that is, I've got a commentary coming out this week called Violence is Declining. And you might say, in light of hearing all of this, this doesn't make a great deal of sense. Well, let me go back to a commentary that I wrote back in April, in which I pointed out that when you hear about how much violence there is, it's located in just a few select areas. The numbers that I was able to show were that over half of all the murders in the United States occur in just 2% of the nation's 3,000 counties. And a high percentage of those, as we are pointing out here, actually were linked either to gang activity or drug activity. And my commentary, which is coming out later this week, actually is, again, just a piece of evidence that has been put forward by, interesting enough, Steven Pinker, who is a liberal, a progressive, a humanist, self-proclaimed. I'm not calling him anything he doesn't call himself, in which in his book that came out a number of years ago, The Better Angels of Our Nature, really documented in over 1,000 pages how violence is going down. Whether you look at it from a millennial point of view, how many millennia, if you look at it in terms of a century point of view, and in terms of a decade point of view, we are really at a time when indeed violence is decreasing. And you might wonder about that because we hear so much about school shootings and terrorist bombings and those kinds of things. And he points out, first of all, that, of course, decline is not the same as disappearance. Less than is not zero. And so, again, something can decrease quite a bit without vanishing altogether. But when you do a comparison of the level of violence in the past to what we have today, we actually are living in one of the best times to ever have lived. Others argue that, well, these statistics mean nothing if you're one of the victims. Okay, I agree with that. But it also means that you're less likely to be a victim. And so, again, all these stories about civil wars, terrorist attacks, examples of violence make it seem, in some respects, more dangerous than it is. And, of course, some have even charged him with being naive and sentimental and idealistic or romantic. But he says, just look at the data. To look at the data, he says, and say that violence has gone up is delusional. To ignore the data and say that violence has gone up is then to be a know-nothing. And so, again, while we talk about this issue of violence, on the one hand, recognize how the mainstream press isn't going to cover some of these stories because it doesn't fit the narrative of a person with a handgun or a rifle killing people at random. But, of course, look at all the dead people and all the individuals that were shot just even this weekend, and they don't get a lot of coverage. And then, of course, when we do talk about it, there's never kind of a disclaimer to say the sad reality is that most of you are probably pretty safe. But if you live in one of those counties, at 2% of the 3,000 counties in America account for 50% of, more than 50% of all the murders. So I just thought I'd use that as an illustration, just a short illustration of the need for you to have discernment and pay attention to some of the facts, the figures, and the statistics. If you'd like to read some of my commentaries, they're available, of course, on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The public debate about transgender students using restrooms and showers became more intense in a small town in Oregon. I've actually preached in a church in this town and can imagine the reaction of the parents. A district judge ruled that a girl who identifies as a boy can use the boy's facilities and vice versa. The judge did offer an alternative. Parents can take their children out of the schools. Well, thank you. These parents pay taxes to support the school, but if they don't like the judge's ruling, they can take their kids somewhere else. Some of the statements in the ruling are extraordinary. The judge argued once the parents have chosen to send their children to school, their liberty interest in their children's education is severely diminished. That sure sounds like he believes that the state really owns the children, not the parents. He also rejected the idea that these students in the public school had any privacy rights. In the past, judges have often used the 14th Amendment to justify finding a privacy right within the Constitution. In this case, the judge in Oregon came to the opposite conclusion. He said that students have no fundamental privacy right to not share school restrooms, lockers, and showers with transgender students. This case is the opposite of the type usually cited. Parents have usually been concerned about the possibility of a boy who identifies as a female wanting to use the girls' showers and restrooms. In this case, it is a girl identifying as a male who wants to shower with the boys. After all, what could possibly go wrong with a naked girl taking a shower with a bunch of naked teenage boys? I think the judge's alternative is prophetic. Yes, parents can take their kids out of the public schools, and I expect more and more of them to do so because of such outrageous judicial rulings. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that if you go to our website, pointofview.net, first of all, you can see my commentary today. I'll talk about that a little bit later this hour. And also, we posted a number of articles. One of those is called The Department of Justice's Religious Liberty Task Force is a breath of fresh air. We did talk about that briefly when we had Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dice in studio on Friday. And this gives just a different perspective to what they experienced. Last week at this time, they were there with the Department of Justice, heard from the Attorney General, heard from the Assistant Attorney General, and there was an announcement of this Religious Liberty Task Force, which, of course, some of our liberal friends have made such fun of. And I thought this piece by Jay Hobbs would be helpful because it just, again, gives you a different perspective. And if nothing else, by the time we're finished, you'll see that this Religious Liberty Task Force wasn't there just to help Christians. As a matter of fact, one of the people that called it a breath of fresh air was a rabbi, because it isn't just Christians or evangelicals or fundamentalists that are finding it difficult for them to just go about their religious activities without interference from the government. And so I thought you might find this helpful. If you'd like to read it in its entirety, it's available at our website, pointofview.net. But anyway, Jay Hobbs says this. Last Monday, the Department of Justice announced the creation of a new Religious Liberty Task Force, a working group within the agency formed to protect the first freedom recognized in the Bill of Rights. He said promptly following the announcement, the cyber mom inadvertently confirmed the importance of the new initiative. Never even thought about that till I read this, because I thought, yes, all of the harsh reaction to that I think just illustrates why we needed the task force. If there had been a collective yawn and sigh and go, I don't know why we need this, I think you might have said, why do we need this? But when there is just an angry, vociferous, over-the-top, hair-on-fire kind of reaction, you go, yeah, I think that maybe is why we need this task force in the first place. Nevertheless, he goes on to say participants practically trampled each other in a mad dash to denounce the Religious Liberty Task Force as the latest sign that the end is nigh. Evidently, it's just a matter of time before a nefarious coalition of Christian nationalists, he's put this in quotes, by the way, these are air quotes here, and the real-life characters from Handmaid's Tale take over the country by force. If you're not familiar with Handmaid's Tale, it's, again, just sort of an anti-Christian, anti-fundamentalist play that's getting a lot of press right now. It was just a book before. Anyway, let's go on. Anyway, he goes on and says, by the time Tuesday morning rolled around, New York Times best-selling author Kurt Eichenwald, who, by the way, used to write for Newsweek, maybe he still does, I'm not sure. I thought he's still at Newsweek, but again, he's a New York Times best-selling author anyway, had emerged as the clear winner in the online race to the bottom, artfully combining snark with ignorance and downright dishonesty, all in the space of just one tweet. Eichenwald provided a well-rounded sampling of the outcry against the Department of Justice. So now I'm going to read from what Kurt Eichenwald said. Eichenwald said, I am delighted that the Religious Liberty Task Force will finally protect people who face problems because of their religions. Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, and other religious minorities. And then he types, tweets, what? Oh, this is just another one about hating gays and forcing people to say Merry Christmas. What a shock. That's about the worst you can get. And I did read that one when it was posted, so this wasn't taken out of context at all. I did actually happen to see that one. Anyway, while Eichenwald's hot take gained plenty of traction, others, including one, and he says, uniquely bizarre essay by a self-identified Baptist pastor writing at NBCnews.com, joined him in building a false narrative that only Christians who still hold to a biblical definition of marriage stand to gain from the Department of Justice's new efforts. And so, again, this is almost like what we used to run into when those people used to talk about satanic ritual abuse. Everything they saw was an evidence of satanic ritual abuse. In this case, everything that somebody sees this is always an example of anti-gay. I mean, if you're seeing everything through the homosexual lens, then everything is anti-gay. It has nothing to do with any other aspect of religious liberty, and that is certainly the case here. Well, anyway, I think this piece is one of the reasons I wanted to post it, is Jay Hobbs then goes on and tries to see if we can bring some perspective to those who haven't completely gone off the deep end. And he said the knee-jerk reactions ignored a truly unifying reality that the task force, indeed religious liberty itself, represents. He said, yes, the Department of Justice's commitment to uphold the First Amendment guarantee of the free exercise of religion does apply to Christians. The Masterpiece Cake owner, Jack Phillips, who was one of the panelists at the Department of Justice Summit on Religious Liberty. But every American, he says, wins when the government allows religious adherents to peacefully live out their beliefs. Religious liberty applies to every American, not just one group. Far from the caricature that Eichenwald and others put forward, the list of panelists at this summit included Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs working together to ensure the American promise of religious liberty to adherents to any faith, including secularism and atheism. You know, I had to smile because when Kurt Eichenwald talked about, well, we need to protect Muslim, Jews, and Sikhs, well, they were on the panel. Pretty obvious you weren't there at the meeting, and you didn't even read the news reports that explained who they were. So let's give you a sense of what everybody seemed to ignore. One of the representatives who spoke at the summit is a Sikh American named Harpreet Singh Mokha, currently serves as the National Program Manager on the issues of concern for Muslim, Arab, Sikh, South Asian, and Hindu populations as part of the Department of Justice's Community Relations Service. During his time on stage, Mokha recalled the obstacles he faced as a young Sikh attorney trying to live consistently with his faith, including growing a beard and donning a turban. He spoke in sobering terms about the threats his community faced in the direct aftermath of September 11th, the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, before going on in detail about the Department of Justice's work in protecting the religious freedom rights of non-Christians throughout the United States. And the promise to protect religious liberty goes far beyond mere talk. Since the beginning of the Trump administration in January of 2017, the Department of Justice has secured 11 indictments and 7 convictions for hate crimes involving attacks or threats of attack against places of worship, majority of which have been involved in non-Christian houses of worship. These would in many cases be a mosque or a synagogue. At one point during the event, Moksha sat on a panel with Rabbi Nuvi Nu, who is a Jewish leader whose congregation has been prevented for over 10 years from occupying a space they purchased in Boca Raton, Florida, due to infringements on Rabbi Nu and his people's religious liberty from local zoning officials. Rabbi Nu, whose family fled persecution at the hands of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, is counting on the Department of Justice's renewed effort to enforce the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act to allow his group and others like it to worship on the property they have purchased. Another group that figures to benefit from their commitment to religious land use concerns is the Muslim population. Asam Udin, herself a Muslim who serves as senior scholar and faculty with the Religious Freedom Center of the Religious Forum Institute. Among Udin, Rabbi Nu's take on the Department of Justice's effort to support the religious liberty of every American was overwhelmingly positive. He said this meeting and this proactive stance on behalf of the Department of Justice is, I think, a very positive message. He said, for us personally, and I think for the core values of this country, it is why people come from all over the world, either from other or even other liberal democracies, to breathe the air of freedom in this country. So while other group of adherents around the United States may face unique challenges to its religious freedom, there are plenty of reasons to hope that all Americans are one step closer to living out their beliefs without fear of government hostility or punishment. And that, to paraphrase Rabbi Nu, is a breath of fresh air. So anyway, that article is the first article we've posted here. And if you just believed what you read in some of the tweets of those criticizing the Religious Liberty Task Force, you would think that this was just an attempt by a few Christians to actually persecute the LGBT community. But if you actually went to the summit, as Kelly Shackelford did, and as a variety of others, including Jeremy Dice, then you would certainly recognize that they saw a very different conference at that summit, and indeed saw that we were talking about protecting the religious rights and religious liberty of a vast group of individuals who have had some real difficulty when it's come to try to put together a synagogue, a mosque, or even a church, or to just simply live out their Christian faith or their other religious faith. So anyway, that is the first article we've posted on the website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Just over 100 years ago, 2 or 3 cents would buy you what it takes $1 to buy today. What of any real value can you buy for $1? Well, how about this? How about enabling one listener to hear Point of View not just today, but for an entire year? You heard right. $1 makes it possible to reach a person through the radio or through any of our online channels for a year, and pays for all the other resources available through our website. All the interviews with special guests and public officials, all the information, all the training, all the inspiration and transformation for $1. How many dollars will you invest in the future of our nation? How many lives can you change with your investment today? Call right now and reach more people to help change our nation. 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net, because $1 really can go a long, long way. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation. If you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. I thought for just a few minutes I might address the issue of Sarah Jeong, and you may say, okay, who is that? If you've been watching the news at all, you probably have heard of the fact that this is an Asian-American woman, actually Korean, went to UC Berkeley, graduated from Harvard Law School, has been very successful, and was hired on with the New York Times. She, to put it mildly, has made some of the most outrageous statements about mostly white men, but not exclusively, just about anybody in the society. But she really does seem to have a thing about white people, especially white men, and the whole Western culture and on and on and on. And a level of hatred and animus I don't know that I've seen for somebody that's going to be working for what's oftentimes referred to as the newspaper of record. Okay, that being said, the comments that some people have made were completely off target, and that is, well, you can't judge her by a few things she said. Very true. You know, as a matter of fact, if you listen to this program, one of the things we were concerned about is a man by the name of Ryan Bounds was being proposed for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. They go all the way back to when I believe he was 19 years of age at Stanford University and pull that quote up and say that's an example of him being a racist, which, by the way, if you look at the context, was not. But, you know, sometimes you're allowed to, you know, make a statement when you're in college and not necessarily say that has anything to do with the fact that you're now twice or three times that age and you've been a federal judge and now you're going to go into the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So sometimes it is unfair. Kevin Williamson, you know, was at National Review. He's hired on by Atlantic. They finally fire him because they find some comments, again, some snarky comments he made. We even the other day talked about, you know, people like Ben Shapiro, others, they're going to make some comments every once in a while. I'm willing to let them pass. You know, I may not have said it that way. I don't agree with it. We have a president that says a lot of things on Twitter that I don't necessarily like. But if you see a pattern, and let's face it, with her, there's definitely a pattern, and you can read her books. You can, more since this has come out, I've read so much and even heard some of her statements, and I'm like, oh. So, again, New York Times, free to hire her, knowing what they've got. Now, maybe they didn't do their due diligence. I can't believe that. So much of her stuff is out there. I think they knew what they were getting, and they get to live with it. You know, you broke it, you buy it. You know, it's the Pottery Barn philosophy, and so it's what you got. But the piece that I put forward here as the second article is a very well-written piece by Jonah Goldberg, Why Racism Begets More Racism. And what he's really doing is talking about the fact that there have been just in a number of activists, many with press credentials, a lot of progressives that have just wanted to defend her. And he starts by telling a story, interestingly enough, when he was a teenager. So this goes way back, of this older woman coming in, and the teller was Asian. And it's an Asian American woman. And she cuts loose on this woman with all the racial epithets, none of which I'll say on the air, but you can think of the kind of phrases that you would use if you were trying to degrade an Asian person, okay? But in the midst of it, what surfaces is, you killed my husband and my son. And so you're thinking, okay, might have lost your husband and your son during World War II. And if you've ever been around somebody in World War II, you sometimes don't refer to the Japanese people. They have some quaint phrases for them. And anyway, the point that Jonah Goldberg was making is, he said, you know, the old lady was wrong in what she did. She may have had plenty of rationalizations and explanations for why she tormented this young Asian American woman, but none of them added up as an excuse. He said, I hadn't thought about that incident until recently, when then, he said, I read the defense of Sarah Jong in the Washington Post, which went on to, for example, say that she went to publish a book about racial attitudes held by students and all those kinds of things. And it seemed to him, again, that we are starting to see people justifying racism, and it's coming from the left. Now, it's coming in a couple of different ways. One is the argument, which is something we've heard now for decades, that it is very easy for a white person to be racist, but it's virtually impossible for a person of color or to be racist, because after all, white people have power, they do not. And I thought it was interesting to begin to go through this very important piece by Jonah Goldberg, because sometimes he says, I am baffled by why this sort of thing is so complicated. I mean, it's not that the left doesn't understand my point. He says, for instance, when an Islamic terrorist murders people, there's an instant rush to fret over and condemn any sort of anti-Muslim backlash. Never mind that such backlashes have been vastly rarer than we've usually been told, but the principle is correct. If it is wrong to blame innocent Muslims for the things other Muslims do. Or just think about how much ink has been spilled arguing that it is unfair and unjust to assume that one black youth is a criminal or a threat just because he resembles in some way a negative stereotype. He says, I'm not marking this argument, I'm agreeing with it. As I've been saying until I'm blue in the face on my book tour, one of the greatest things about this country is the ideal, always in tension with the lesser devils of our natures that says we should take people as we find them. My objection, he says, to identity politics is that it reduces millions of people to a single attribute or grievance. It assumes that simply by accident of birth, some people are more noble and others are more evil than others. Now, if you think that all you need to know about an African-American person to size up his character or humanity is his skin color, then you're a racist. Imagine some guy named Joe emerges from a block of ice and trying to catch up on the news by talking to the first friend he meets is David, okay? Which I think he's kind of making it sound like David Duke or something like that. But anyway, Joe, who is Barack Obama? David, oh, he's a black guy. Joe, who's Thomas Sowell? Oh, another black guy. Joe, who's O.J. Simpson? A black guy. And who is this Willie Horton fellow? A typical black guy. It shouldn't take genius to see that David's pretty hardcore racist. You can run similar thought experiments through virtually any group, and all you need to know about Oscar Wilde is that he was a gay dude, or Richard Simmons, or Milo, what's his name, and you're a bigot, or it goes through this long list of, ways in which people get identified by their gender, their sexual orientation exclusively. And he says, again, historically, this is mostly a left-wing or liberal insight. But for some bizarre reason, for many people, this idea evaporates like water off of a hot skillet when you replace any of those categories with white or very often male. Suddenly, fancy words and phrases fly like sawdust off of a wood chipper. Structures of oppression, decontextualized, ahistoricized. It's so clever and complicated. The same people will take up the streets at the slightest suggestion that Muslims can be judged by the evil deeds of other Muslims, will harangue and lecture us for hours and mob you on Twitter or condescendingly dismiss you for not understanding that all white people have it coming. He says, I'm not denying the history of white racism in America. I'm more than eager to acknowledge it. But what these people are basically saying is that bigoted things about all white people based on things that other white people have done. And spare me the argument that some 70-hour-a-week truck driver in Appalachia has it coming because he's the grand beneficiary of white supremacy. He really cut loose on that. And then begins to post some of these Twitter defenses, which, again, are hard to read on the air because they use the N-word or some of the other words that are used to talk about whoever. And you can begin to see that, again, as he says, I'm skipping through a lot of tweets and Twitter posts. He says, I don't think all these arguments are ridiculous. There is a serious argument that white racism is different contextually from, say, black racism. What I'm saying is these people are ridiculously changing the argument in order to justify glib bigotry. And so the point he's making is simply this. The New York Times is free to hire Sarah Jong, and they have. It's their company, and they can have it. And every time we read her, I guarantee you that the first time we read one of her pieces, it will have been heavily edited, because if she's allowed to say in the New York Times what she says in Twitter, if she's allowed to say in the New York Times what I've heard her say when she's given lectures, I guarantee you the New York Times would be subject to libel suits and certainly have people cancel their subscription just because of the profanity alone. And so we'll see where it goes. But the bottom line is when you endorse this kind of behavior, whether it comes from one ethnic group or the other, whether it's white, black, brown, whatever, you are going to create more of it, because then you provide a platform for it. And others say, well, if she can get away with it, then I can get away with it. And it's a race to the bottom. We've seen this with profanity. Everybody swears, so after a while, more people that never would have said a swear word begin to swear. When people can say racist comments with impunity, you're going to hear more of them. I'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Have you ever been concerned when you heard someone praying? Sandra McDonald was. She was the new site coordinator for Jenny Lind Elementary School and responsible for the after-school use of the school building by groups from the community. Child Evangelism Fellowship had a chapter of its Good News Club meeting at the school. McDonald happened by one day and was, quote, concerned about the religious content of the clubs after overhearing a prayer in reference to Jesus Christ during a meeting, unquote. Ultimately, the club was told that it would be removed from the after-school lineup of club offerings. It would still be able to meet, but the school would no longer provide the same transportation and food services that it provided for the Boy and Girl Scouts, Big Brother Big Sister, and other clubs meeting at the same time. Child Evangelism Fellowship challenged the decision, and in Child Evangelism Fellowship of Minnesota versus Minneapolis Special School District No. 1, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit concluded that the school had been unlawfully hostile to a religious club, but favorable to similarly situated secular clubs, when it should have been neutral toward all clubs. School districts should not be concerned when religious clubs act like religious clubs, and it violates the Constitution to treat them differently from other clubs. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again for just a few more minutes. Let me just mention that second article I've posted here by Jonah Goldberg, it goes on for pages, so I've really left out more than I've put on the air. But again, you can read it in its entirety. It goes on for basically 7 pages before he gets into another topic. And near the end, he talks about the bigger problem, which gets to the title of his article, and that is racism begets racism. That is, the more we normalize something, the more it becomes even more likely that people will use it. And a second issue, and he says the social science is mounting every day, that the more often people make these arguments, the more often they're making white people think of themselves as white people. And he goes to point to that doesn't necessarily work very well, because if nothing else, you can begin to see that then you end up with the problem, which is kind of the theme of his book, which I think I mentioned his book again this week coming out in one of my commentaries, and that is the issue of tribalism. Once you start seeing more and more people as tribes, then you no longer think of yourself as a community. Even in my own neighborhood, my wife and I walk every single day, and when I was thinking about Jonah Goldberg's book, I'm thinking, we think of ourselves as a community. We think of ourselves as, being Spring Meadow and Allen, Texas, where we live and all that kind of stuff. We get together in a meeting, I'm looking around, and we think of ourselves as equal neighbors, and we're all friends, and we know each other. But if you start dividing by race, you go, okay, well, we've got Muslims, we've got Indians, we've got Asians, we've got a variety of different socioeconomic backgrounds, just even in our own neighborhood, ethnic backgrounds, genders, all sorts of things. And when you start, again, emphasizing the particular identity politics, that even itself is something that could have a situation in which racism begets racism. So he's got some pretty good arguments there. But in the interest of time, I want to just real quickly also read from Derek Hunter. His title, I think, is kind of fun. Double standards are the only standards liberals have. And he points out early on in the article that, racism is tossed around all the time. He says it's tossed around like an Olympic event. People are going for gold. Everything that we talk about now is racist. Okay, we've heard that. And he says the only thing leftists won't label as racist is racism by leftists. And he says progressive activists with press credentials across the country rush to defend Sarah Jeong, the newest leftist to join the New York Times editorial board, when it discovered that she had a years-long history of tweeting racist comments about white people. And then he goes through the long list of them, none of which I could read on the air, but you can read them for yourself and see how awful they are, and to recognize that these are years long. Ryan Bounds, who was actually vilified because of something he said when he was a college student at Stanford, that's really unfair. Or to pull one comment that maybe Kevin Williamson has said, and that's enough to fire him from Atlanta, that strikes me as unfair. They're free to do so. After all, they run the paper and they run the magazine, and that's their choice. But I think it's unfair. This is not unfair, because the reality is very quickly people recognize, no, I can't defend this as having happened years ago. This is happening all the time, and we've got the long tradition of it. So basically, he says the argument from the left is Jeong can't be racist because she's a woman and a minority. Of course, you've said any of these things about blacks or Hispanics or not white people, then she'd be condemned because on the progressive sliding scale of victimhood, Asians rate lower than those groups. And again, I don't agree with that. That's just the way that game is played. And what this is called is intersectionality. Derek Hunter mentions it, but there's a very good Dennis Prager piece, because what it argues is that you can add these up. If you're a black woman, well, you face racism because you're black, and you face maybe misogyny because you're a woman, and maybe something else. Maybe if you're a lesbian, they face homophobia. And so intersectionality actually has, if you will, a scale on those who are the greatest victims, and it sets up a hierarchy of victimhood. Anyway, that was a piece that was in there as well. And the point he's making is the whole ridiculous concept, which is basically a way for leftists to absolve themselves of their hatred, is certainly something that is going to be used in the next couple of weeks to basically argue that racism towards, or racist comments towards white people is not racist. And again, what Derek Hunter says is racism. A reverse racism would be someone who isn't a racist, but such is the state of the political left. They create terms, bastardize others, and never, ever let anything stand in the way of their ultimate goal of obtaining power. And so in addition to a racism, again, what I think began to get a lot of people's attention is that Sarah Jeong also said all of this about police officers, tweeting that, again, she uses the F word and all sorts of things about the police, cheering for their murder, and a variety of other things. That started becoming even more difficult for some to actually defend. And yet most of this is wrapped into, as he says, with her Harvard law degree and a victim mentality protected by progressives because she's on their team. Then he goes in and points out that some of these individuals, he uses Al Franken as one example, but there are others who have been outed because of the Me Too sexual abuse scandals, are saying, yeah, maybe we can rehabilitate some of those individuals because, after all, we like those individuals. We like how they voted, and maybe we can just simply defend them as maybe making a mistake in the past. And so is it possible that Al Franken will run for office again? Is it possible, as he said, that Harvey Weinstein will be producing movies and hosting Democratic Party fundraisers again? We'll see what that is the case, but I thought it was interesting that Derek Hunter raises that question. So if that surfaces later, we'll go back and consider Derek Hunter a prophet in his own time. Finally, says the New York Times doesn't care that they've hired a racist who hates police and wishes them death. Democrats have burned more calories trying to distance their radical base from the murder of police officers by its members than they have been condemning those murders. So what's a little racism for the cause? He says, for decades, the political left has held conservatives to the highest standards while exempting themselves, but rarely has it been laid so clear. The party of tolerance hates you if you are conservative. They hate you if you are indifferent. They hate you if you are aren't sufficiently liberal. Quite simply, they just hate you. And we've seen that as well, that some of these individuals that have been part of, if you will, the leftist coalition, as soon as they begin to depart just a little bit from the plantation, they find themselves in all sorts of difficulties. And, of course, we've talked about how that has played its out with Alan Dershowitz and a variety of others that at one time were part of the party. But as soon as they stray just a little bit, then you begin to see that indeed maybe they're no longer going to be given the same kind of rights, because there is a kind of a strict attempt to make sure, with almost a totalitarian desire to keep people within certain boundaries and not to allow them to stray. But nevertheless, just a few comments about Sarah Jeong. And if you'd like to read this piece by Jonah Goldberg, that would be, I think, very interesting indeed, because his book, The Death of the West, The Suicide of the West, is really a very good book. But in the midst of this is perhaps one more illustration of what happens when we divide by race, identity politics, and when we begin to engage in tribalism. Then we can justify racism and not understand that sometimes justifying racism begets more racism, which is the title of his piece. My commentary today is on transgender showers. Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later, but when we come back, I want to spend some time focusing on this new book, Redeeming Capitalism. Kenneth Barnes, who says, capitalism has kind of gone astray because it's become kind of a, if you will, a postmodern capitalism, doesn't have any ethical standard. And so he wants to move from a postmodern capitalism to a redeemed or virtuous capitalism. I think he's got some great arguments and some points. So,
police officer telling you can't pray in your own home. That happened not too long ago to Mary Ann Souse in Kansas. And in 2017, the U.S. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the officer. But this year, thanks to an investment of $1, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that ruling. Okay, let me explain. Over the years, listeners to Point of View have made a big difference. Some have become congressmen. Others have saved lives through helping women in crisis pregnancies. Others have become constitutional attorneys, like Kelly Shackelford, who represented Mary Ann Souse. We recently discovered it costs about $1 to reach a Point of View listener on the radio and online for an entire year. You can't buy much for $1 these days, but you can transform the nation. Call today and invest in Point of View at 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net, because $1 really can go a long, long way. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to this program, you know that we oftentimes talk about the free enterprise system and capitalism, and we've even talked about how to really think about this from a Christian point of view, and that's really going to be our focus this hour today, because this new book on redeeming capitalism really begins to make the argument that we maybe have gone astray by developing what you might call postmodern capitalism, and we need to move to what might be called virtuous or redeemed capitalism. And so we're going to get into that in some detail. The author of the book is Dr. Ken Barnes. He holds the chair on workplace theology and business ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Really combines a career in international business with a life as a theological scholar and a bivocational pastor. Has recently in the past served as the dean of the Marketplace Institute in the Ridley Theological College in Melbourne, Australia. Also the associate director of the Entrepreneurial Leadership Initiative at Oxford, and is the author of this particular book on redeeming capitalism. Even there, when he's been at Oxford, has taught a piece which is entitled More Money Than God, Wealth, Virtue, and the Redemption of Postmodern Capitalism. And Dr. Barnes, it is great to have you on the program with us today.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
We sometimes do talk about this issue of capitalism, and today I really do encourage our listeners to kind of sit back for a few minutes and let you do some teaching. We're going to be talking about Adam Smith. We're going to get into Karl Marx, Max Weber. We're going to talk about the whole idea of how to think about economics from a biblical point of view. A little bit later, if some of you want to open up the phones, we'll open the phones, give you a chance to ask a question. But you may want to just sit back and take some notes. And if you find yourself fascinated by this book, it's published by Erdman's. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but because it's a little more academic, we've also, as we always do, have made a link so that you can order it either in hardcover or Kindle and learn a little bit more. And certainly if you have a young person who is saying, you know, maybe we just need to go to a socialist economy because capitalism hasn't worked so well, this would be a book that would be a great antidote. But let's start off, Dr. Barnes, by talking about your first chapter, Capitalism. What went wrong? There are obviously some need to change what we have, but let's talk about some of the problems. What are they?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, I spent most of my adult life doing international business at a very high level all over the world, 6 continents. And I ran some very large businesses, and I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly of capitalism. And the global financial crisis of 2008, I think for me, was a tipping point. And it was for a lot of other people, too, because it made those of us who really appreciate the magnificent wealth creation power of capitalism to question what was wrong with its soul, that it could allow something as dramatic as the global financial crisis to happen. So as I unpacked the global financial crisis, what I found was actually capitalism doesn't have a soul, and that's the problem. Capitalism, if you will, is a subject, not an object. It doesn't possess any hypostasis, to use a good Greek theological term, of its own. It has no mind behind it. It has no agency behind it. Capitalism is just a term that we use to describe the cumulative effect of countless individual and corporate choices that are made in a system which is lightly regulated and highly monetized. And that's all it is. unlike an artificial construct like Marxism or other isms that have been tried before, utopian solutions. Capitalism, if you will, is just kind of the way free markets evolved over time. And with the introduction of technology during the Great Industrial Revolution and the introduction of fractional banking in the 17th century, it just went on steroids and created wealth in ways that no one thought possible. But because it doesn't have a moral compass of its own, because it possesses no character traits of its own, it will reflect the morality or lack thereof of the cultures in which it resides. So what I did in the book is I said, well, what was capitalism like when Adam Smith observed it in the 18th century and wrote, of course, his seminal work on capitalism, The Wealth of Nations, or at another epoch when Max Weber was observing the capitalism of the earliest 20th century in America. What were the underlying moral ethics there, and how does it differ from today? And that's really the crux of the book. And the fact of the matter is, it differs dramatically.
Well, and again, one of the things I've done when I've taught on this, and that's why I love the similarity between how you've covered this, you have a section here where you talk about the cardinal virtues, because when I was at Georgetown, we would read, the Summa Theologica, and really Aquinas wasn't just asking what is price, he was asking what is a just price. And so there was a time, and you have to go back centuries, in which ethics and economics went together. And you even mentioned Adam Smith. He really is a moral philosopher. When I was there, we also had to read, the Theory of Moral Sentiments before you even read The Wealth of Nations. So there was a time in which ethics and economics did go together. And today, it's kind of just utilitarian kinds of philosophy. So isn't that part of our problem, because we don't have an ethical system tied to our culture or even tied to our economic system?
Well, that's exactly right. In fact, for all of human history, with the exception of the recent past, economics was not a modeling science. Economics was a moral science. And it was always presumed that there was a moral responsibility, a moral ethic undergirding economic activity. And in the book, I go back to the Bible. I go back to the Old Testament, New Testament, then the church fathers. I unpack Aquinas, Augustine first, and then Aquinas, and Calvin, and all the way on up to modern Catholic social teaching. And I talk about the fact that the capitalism we have is a kind of mutant postmodern capitalism, because it has really swallowed hook, line, and sinker the ethical egoism, if you will, of Ayn Rand and others who believe, quite contrary to Christian teaching, that the only ethic that's required is self-interest. And that is simply not a viable ethic for any economic system. There is a place for self-interest. There is a place for self-love, without question, but not at the expense of others. That is selfishness. And that's what we've defaulted to. And that's because we live in a post-Christian relativism when it comes to moral absolutes. And we suffer from the hermeneutic of suspicion, if you will, against all moral absolutes that are part of postmodernism. So what I basically say in the book is we've got to change the narrative to bring virtue, and not just the cardinal virtues, by the way. What I think is unique about this book from anything else that's been written on the topic, I also insist that we reintroduce the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, because there's a place for them in economics as well.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into this in a little more detail. Adam Smith talked about this idea of self-interest, but you can pursue self-interest without selfishness. And what about Karl Marx and his analysis and critique of capitalism? What about Max Weber and the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism? We've got a lot to cover and a great teaching opportunity. Let me take a break, and we'll come back with Dr. Kenneth Barnes right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The public debate about transgender students using restrooms and showers became more intense in a small town in Oregon. I've actually preached in a church in this town and can imagine the reaction of the parents. A district judge ruled that a girl who identifies as a boy can use the boy's facilities and vice versa. The judge did offer an alternative. Parents can take their children out of the schools. Well, thank you. These parents pay taxes to support the school, but if they don't like the judge's ruling, they can take their kids somewhere else. Some of the statements in the ruling are extraordinary. The judge argued once the parents have chosen to send their children to school, their liberty interest in their children's education is severely diminished. That sure sounds like he believes that the state really owns the children, not the parents. He also rejected the idea that these students in the public school had any privacy rights. In the past, judges have often used the 14th Amendment to justify finding a privacy right within the Constitution. In this case, the judge in Oregon came to the opposite conclusion. He said that students have no fundamental privacy right to not share school restrooms, lockers, and showers with transgender students. This case is the opposite of the type usually cited. Parents have usually been concerned about the possibility of a boy who identifies as a female wanting to use the girls' showers and restrooms. In this case, it is a girl identifying as a male who wants to shower with the boys. After all, what could possibly go wrong with a naked girl taking a shower with a bunch of naked teenage boys? I think the judge's alternative is prophetic. Yes, parents can take their kids out of the public schools, and I expect more and more of them to do so because of such outrageous judicial rulings. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, privileged to have with us today Dr. Kenneth Barnes, and the book is entitled Redeeming Capitalism, and it is a book that I think you're going to find very helpful, published by Erdman's, and about 230 pages. You can find information about it on our website. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to order. And Ken, let's, if we can, get to Adam Smith, a professor of basically moral philosophy, but one of the most famous quotes you start that chapter is, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." And so he says we're almost led by an invisible hand to bring about something we did not necessarily intend, but as individuals seek their self-interest, of the common good is enhanced. Now, I take it back in his day that you understood that self-interest is just the way we're constructed. It's in my self-interest to get a job to support my family. From a Christian point of view, it's in my self-interest to accept the gospel. So, I mean, self-interest can be done in a way that's not selfish, but we've moved into, as you said, this sort of postmodern capitalism, which doesn't look at ethics. It only looks at me. And so as a result, some of those guidelines, some of those moral ideas, some of those virtues are missing, aren't they?
Well, they are. And let's talk about the invisible hand for a moment, if we may. I think this is one of the most misunderstood parts of what Adam Smith is talking about. First of all, Adam Smith didn't believe there was an invisible hand. That was nothing more than an anthropomorphic description of the phenomenon of self-correcting markets. That's all it was.
Right.
So, of course, people have self-interest. The double love command says we shall love the Lord our God with all our heart, our mind, our strength, our soul, and our neighbors as ourselves. The presumption is it's certainly natural to love yourself, and you should love and take care of yourself. So Adam Smith was simply saying that a person who reasonably looks after themselves will, in the cumulative effect of others doing it, help everyone without trying to manipulate the system for any particular end. That's perfectly rational. That's very, very different from naked self-interest. Self-interest which has morphed into all that matters is my own personal well-being, my own personal wealth, my own personal aggrandizement, and it doesn't matter what happens to anyone else. That is unfortunately the kind of ethical egoism that has crept into our narrative around business today. And in some ways, you know, as I say in the book, I think it was somewhat the thinking, if you will, the logic behind Milton Friedman's famous instructions about what he thought the moral responsibility of corporate executives was, which was to make as much money as possible within the constraints of law and custom. So, you know, we've got to accept the fact that this narrative is out there, but we don't have to accept its inevitability, because it's not inevitable.
One of the things you talk about is this idea of postmodern capitalism, and you define it as capitalism that is devoid of a moral compass and is resistant, if not impervious, to ethical constraints. So how does that play out? Because you talked about the crisis in 2008, and we can talk about the banking industry, and we can talk about international banking and some of that. But you know as well as I do that one of the reasons many of the students you run into, whether it's at Oxford, whether it's at Gordon Conwell or whatever, say, you know, maybe socialism is better than capitalism because they've accepted some of the kind of the Marxist critique that came from the 19th century.
Well, first of all, let me just say that when we talk about Karl Marx, we need to understand that Karl Marx was a Marxist, not a socialist. In fact, he was very critical of socialism because he didn't believe socialism went far enough.
Right.
So sometimes people convolute those terms, and I don't think that's fair. I think we need to be distinct because Marx himself was distinct, and there are many democratic governments around the world, especially in Northern Europe, that combine free market capitalism and socialism in a way that works for them according to their own social constructs. Now, that's not the same thing, however, as totalitarian Marxism. And the reason why Marx is wrong is because he misunderstood the nature of wealth. He misunderstood what wealth really is. So in the book, I make it very clear. I give a definition of wealth, which perhaps others haven't heard before, and that is that wealth is nothing more than the delta between the amount of labor and resources necessary for subsistence and everything else, which means that wealth, unlike matter, is not finite. It can be both created and destroyed. Marx, on the other hand, defined wealth as the accumulated value of all commodities. He believed it to be finite. And so he tried to construct an economic utopia that divided the wealth instead of creating an environment that took advantage of human ingenuity to create wealth. And obviously, creating wealth is much better, much more efficient to take people out of poverty than assuming that there is a limited amount of wealth which has to be divided. And this is where Marx just is fundamentally wrong. But he was right about one thing. He was right about the fact that if you wanted his utopia to exist, you'd have to enforce it through means of arms. Well, I would say that any utopia which must be enforced through means of arms is actually a dystopia. And that's what we saw in the Soviet Union. That's what we saw in Cuba. That's what we saw in communist China before it accepted free market capitalism as an economic system, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think we have to go very far to debunk, Karl Marx. But I think I give him a fair reading because some of his observations about the excesses of capitalism, which, is something that we need to be concerned about, were accurate. It's just that his solution was completely wrong. And I've spoken to an awful lot of people, by the way, who still think that the solution to the problems we have, the excesses and the abuses of capitalism, somehow are legislative or regulatory in nature. And here's what I tell my students. We defer to legislation and regulation when ethics fail.
Mm-hmm.
If we've got a moral problem, then ethics is the only possible solution. Not the government, but capitalists recognizing their responsibility to ensure that this engine of wealth creation works for everybody.
Well, and the other part about dividing, a lot of young people I run into kind of buy into a zero-sum game. In other words, the success in one area of the free market is due to the failure in somewhere else. And as you point out, instead of trying to figure out how to divide the resources that are there, how about finding a way to create more wealth and to actually increase the value for individuals that, especially that have been brought in the last few decades out of extreme poverty? So that's another one of those issues. Even if they don't even know who Karl Marx is, even if they've never read any economic theory at all, they still sort of buy into the fact that the economy sometimes is a zero-sum game. So we have to figure out how to redivide the resources we have, rather than allow an entrepreneurial spirit to create more resources and more value.
Exactly. And that is part of the problem. That's why I say at the end of the book that this book is not a manifesto for a movement. It's the credo of a community of people of goodwill who believe that we can do better. And it's going to take a generation or two to change it because we didn't get here overnight. But it starts by people of goodwill having this conversation and saying that we're going to try to redeem it, not just from the top down, which I have a chapter on that,
yes,
but also from the bottom up.
Bottom up, yeah.
We have to redeem it from the bottom up. And that starts with good education.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about what would capital look like in a virtuous system, and how can we maybe redeem this business culture that we've been talking about, and how can we put love in kind of the center of economic opportunity and activity, and how does that all fit together? Because this certainly helps us get some ideas about how to redeem capitalism. And that's, of course, the title of the book, Redeeming Capitalism. Dr. Kenneth Barnes with us. We're going to take a break, and we'll continue our conversation with him. The book is published by Eardsman's, and again, about 230 pages, some really helpful chapters that not only look at some of the issues that have really created the world that we find ourselves in, kind of a postmodern capitalism, but what would a virtuous capitalism look like, and how do we begin to make at least small steps in that direction? So if you'd like to know a little bit more about this particular book, we have information on our website, pointofview.net. And we certainly do encourage you to sit back and take some notes in this last half hour, when we will focus on some of those possible solutions and apply biblical principles to the issue of the free market and capitalism. All that coming up right after this.
Just over 100 years ago, 2 or 3 cents would buy you what it takes $1 to buy today. What of any real value can you buy for $1? Well, how about this? How about enabling one listener to hear Point of View not just today, but for an entire year? You heard right. $1 makes it possible to reach a person through the radio or through any of our online channels for a year, and pays for all the other resources available through our website. All the interviews with special guests and public officials, all the information, all the training, all the inspiration and transformation for $1. How many dollars will you invest in the future of our nation? How many lives can you change with your investment today? Call right now and reach more people to help change our nation. 1-800-347-5151, or visit pointofview.net, because $1 really can go a long, long way. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Kerby's with us for a little bit longer, Dr. Kenneth Barnes. And again, he is the author of the book Redeeming Capitalism. And again, we're talking about this idea of almost a postmodern capitalism. So how do we think about this from a Christian point of view? And Ken, first of all, you have a chapter called God and Mammon, a Biblical Perspective. So I guess we need to kind of come back to kind of basic principles on how we would use some of these key principles in the Old Testament and the New Testament to begin to reform and ultimately redeem capitalism. How do we go about that?
Well, the simple answer is that the Bible has much to teach us about economics. In fact, the Bible refers to issues relating to economics and work more than it does about heaven, hell, sin, and sexual relations combined. There's a tremendous wealth of information in the Bible concerning what we do with the gifts that God has given us to live our lives. It's known basically as the cultural mandate. It goes back to the very beginning of the Bible, where we are commanded to go and multiply and be fruitful. So it's no surprise to me, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who reads the Bible, that there are lots of things written about why we work, what the purpose of work is, what the responsibilities of wealth are, what our responsibilities to the poor are, how we're supposed to conduct ourselves in terms of honesty and integrity in the marketplace. All of these things are dealt with extensively in the Bible. And what I think we find quite clearly is that there's absolutely nothing in the Bible which would restrict in any way private ownership or entrepreneurial activity or the accumulation of wealth. There's just no suggestion at all that I can find that would be discouraged or prohibited in any way. However, what we do have is an overwhelming sense that with that kind of wealth comes tremendous responsibility.
Right.
And even warnings about the fact that wealth can be very seductive and wealth can become an idol. In fact, the Apostle Paul says that greed is idolatry, which of course would have been the most grotesque sin to any Jewish person, is to commit idolatry. So we've got to understand the macroeconomics, if you will, of God's kingdom, and that is that human economic activity is for the purpose of human flourishing across the board. So while we may have opportunities for individuals to become wealthy, that is a double-edged sword, because to whom much is given, much is expected. The general purpose is that all the boats rise with the tide, that everyone benefits from wealth creation. So how does that relate to capitalism? Well, I can tell you that capitalism has done more to take people out of poverty and to improve the quality of people's lives by every imaginable metric, from longevity to quality of health care to access to education to the arts, than all the other economic constructs combined. So capitalism does a great job. However, if we allow the postmodern ethic of me, of greed and fear to take over, then we end up with this very dangerous economic system, which creates wealth for the wrong reasons and also concentrates wealth in a way that doesn't allow everyone to flourish. And this is our great mandate as Christians, to ensure that we don't allow that to happen, because we're ultimately responsible for how the system works, because we all participate in it.
And again, biblical ideas about work, about freedom, and about private property, about wealth, about the dangers of wealth, all very important aspects, which is part of one of your chapters. The thing I appreciate as well is that you remind us that theologians were addressing that. Let's just use John Calvin as an example. I've said that it used to be that when you were to teach, say, in a Bible school or a seminary, that's before we really had some of those things in the 19th century, but still you would teach all of that, and now we sort of in our seminaries teach just so God talk, you know. So when I would be at a seminary and I'd talk about economics, there was just sort of this idea that, well, that's sort of outside of theology. No, theology was, whether it was Augustine, Aquinas, Calvin, Luther, I mean, the great theologians spent time talking about virtue, and they spent time talking about money and about wealth and about our responsibility. And so you have a chapter there just to help us understand that we don't have to create all of this from scratch. In some respects, we can rely upon those who have come before us to think biblically about some of these issues that relate to the economic world.
Well, that's exactly right. You know, I think I have 100 and some biblical references in the book, and as you say, you know, an entire chapter on the great theologians of the past. You know, here at Gordon Conwell, I'm very blessed to have this chair. Not many seminaries, to my knowledge, have a chair specifically to workplace theology and business ethics. I mean, I'm very proud. And remember, Gordon Conwell built its reputation on biblical scholarship. And so for a seminary such as ours to take this topic so seriously is a good sign. And I travel to other seminaries, and I lecture at other seminaries, and I consult other seminaries about how they can build similar programs at their schools as well. Because one of the problems is that we have this sacred secular divide. And unfortunately, it's the church who has helped create that divide. We've unfortunately bought into what really is a heresy, the suggestion that there's a spiritual realm and there's a secular realm, and as long as everything's okay in our spiritual world, what happens in the secular world, well, doesn't really matter much. Well, you know, I'm a devotee of Abraham Kuyper, the famous Dutch theologian, the Calvinist theologian, who famously said that there is not 1 square inch of our existence over which Christ, who is sovereign, does not proclaim mine. It all belongs to Christ. It all belongs to God, including our economic activity, because we spend something on the order of 60% of our waking hours in some form of economic activity, both paid and unpaid. So how we do it and what we do with the fruits of it matter very much to God.
Let's, if we can, take a break. But just before we do so, let's take a phone call. And so if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But let's head to Maine. First of all, Bob, thank you for joining us today. What would you like to ask or comment on?
Hi, thank you, Kerby. Yeah, I wonder if he could expound a little bit on the concept of usury and also living wage and also the Hebrew practice of Jubilee years. Thank you so much, and I'll hang on.
Sure. Usury and wages and Jubilee. Quite a few issues there.
Well, that's a lot to unpack, but thank you for the question. In some ways, they're related. Let's start with usury. Well, you mentioned John Calvin before. If it weren't for Calvin, we wouldn't have the banking system we have today. Because for most of Christendom, theologians, including Aquinas, by the way, believed that it was inappropriate to charge interest on money because they viewed money as fallow. They didn't actually understand, again, that money is nothing more than a representation of wealth, and money does nothing more than bring liquidity into an economy, and therefore it isn't fallow. It is a tool that we use to help create more wealth. So we take something which is dormant, which is money, which is past wealth, and we release its value into the economy to help people use it in ways to create new wealth. Now, in return for that, it is reasonable to expect some guarantee of return based on the nature of the investment. So Calvin came along and he said, now, wait a minute. The scholastics and the theologians of the past were wrong because in the Bible, the Jews were allowed to charge interest outside of their community because within the community, remembering that these people were primarily minority communities, very often nomadic communities, the charging of interest within the community was seen as being dangerous because there would be an unequal power relationship between the lender and the borrower, and cohesive harmony within the community was more important. But because they did recognize the fact that there was a reasonable expectation of return on the lending of wealth for people who were not part of the community, for people who were coming in and out of their presence, they could reasonably charge interest. So Calvin said, really the same thing applies today. Calvin was speaking, 2,000 years after most of the Old Testament rules on usury were written, and Calvin said, in a modern economy, his modern economy, we now have mobility and liquidity and nation states and secular laws and other things which protect people in their investments. And as long as we didn't overcharge interest, we could do it.
Let's take a break, and we'll come back and finish that comment. And we are continuing our conversation today with Kenneth Barnes. We'll continue right after these messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Have you ever been concerned when you heard someone praying? Sandra McDonald was. She was the new site coordinator for Jenny Lind Elementary School and responsible for the after-school use of the school building by groups from the community. Child Evangelism Fellowship had a chapter of its Good News Club meeting at the school. McDonald happened by one day and was, quote, concerned about the religious content of the clubs after overhearing a prayer in reference to Jesus Christ during a meeting, unquote. Ultimately, the club was told that it would be removed from the after-school lineup of club offerings. It would still be able to meet, but the school would no longer provide the same transportation and food services that it provided for the Boy and Girl Scouts, Big Brother Big Sister, and other clubs meeting at the same time. Child Evangelism Fellowship challenged the decision, and in Child Evangelism Fellowship of Minnesota versus Minneapolis Special School District No. 1, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit concluded that the school had been unlawfully hostile to a religious club, but favorable to similarly situated secular clubs, when it should have been neutral toward all clubs. School districts should not be concerned when religious clubs act like religious clubs, and it violates the Constitution to treat them differently from other clubs. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes today as we talk with Kenneth Barnes. And let me just again mention, Ken, that when we even hear your answer about usury and debt and interest and things like that, it just, again, sets aside this argument that, well, Christians have nothing to really contribute to this debate. We are the beneficiaries of other theologians, other Christians in previous generations to think about these issues. And the fact that you've quoted from everybody from Abraham Kuyper to John Calvin to Aquinas and Augustine and on, just illustrate again how important it is if a Christian really wants to understand the economic world. he or she really needs to dip into some of these theological writings. And again, high marks for Gordon Conwell for actually creating a chair for workplace theology and business ethics, because, as you said, I'm not familiar with too many other places in the world that allow that to happen. And so I'm very grateful for that. Any other comments you might make for Bob's questions about, say, like Jubilee as well?
Well, yes, but if I may, just let me finish what I was saying about usury. So Calvin came to the conclusion that you could charge interest on a business transaction as long as it wasn't excessive. And what he meant by that was it shouldn't be merely market-driven. It should ensure that it doesn't violate what theologians of his day would have called natural justice. And he said that ultimately our theology of love thy neighbor should be the overriding force in determining how we should treat interest. So he said, for instance, that you could never charge interest to a person in need. If a person was in genuine need, you had to give them what they needed. And so part of the problem today is that we have a situation where actually we have a credit system that is more punitive toward the poor than the rich. And I think that's a moral problem. And that's one of the things I talk about in the book, that we've got to get our heads around the fact that we are violating these basic Christian principles about usury when we take advantage of the least able to pay. He also said, by the way, that the benefit of any loan should always be greater to the borrower than the lender. And I just think that's a fantastic way of looking at it because, again, it comes down to the ethic of love. The second question was about a living wage. And I really want to thank him for that because I talk about this in the book. When we talk about labor as just another commodity that is driven solely by market forces, we actually play into a Marxist understanding of labor, a Marxist understanding of labor as a tradable commodity, no different in intrinsic value from any inanimate object. And I think that is wrong. Human beings are created in the image of God, which means that the labor contribution to economics should be treated differently from any other commodity in the system because human beings are uniquely created in the image of God. And it was none other than Adam Smith who argued that no full-time employee should ever be paid less than slightly more than required for subsistence, what we would call today a living wage. Now, I want to clarify something. I'm not suggesting the government pass legislation on that. As I've said before, we only defer to legislation when ethics fail. What I would like to see is corporations in boardrooms making decisions about wages that reflect the dignity of every human being in their organization and not merely treating human labor as any other tradable commodity. I think that would be a major step toward redeeming capitalism.
You know, I just mentioned you do have a section there under common grace, wisdom, and virtue that gets into the issue of living wage. And since we only have a few minutes left, let me at least focus on one of the more significant aspects of your book, and that is this whole idea of wisdom and virtue. But in particular, you really even talk about this idea of faith, hope, and love. How do we apply that common phrase that we read about in Scripture into this area of economics?
Well, it's very simple. You cannot have a properly functioning capitalist system without faith. I was lecturing once to a group of people on a different topic. It happened to be on the existence of God in Oxford. I was doing it just outside of Oxford. And I asked everyone in the room if there was anyone who didn't operate according to a faith-based system. And one young man put his hand up, and he said, I operate because of facts, not faith. And I asked him if he had any money on him, and he pulled out a 5-pound note. And I said, I'll bet you that 5-pound note that you order most of your life on a faith proposition. And I then explained to him what fiat money is. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the money we use is nothing more than ink-stained paper. It is faith in that system, right, in that money, that allows it to function beyond just the objective reality of its ink and paper. And I proceeded to put the 5-pound note in my pocket and got a nice laugh from everybody. But of course, it's true. You can't have economic intercourse on a daily basis if you don't trust each other, if you don't presume that people are being honest and faithful. We also have to have faith in things bigger than ourselves. And part of the problem with postmodern culture today is that we've lost faith in those things. God, first of all, for believers, but even for non-believers. We've lost faith in government. We've lost faith in capitalism. We've lost faith in our institutions. If we ever lose faith in the dollar, our entire system will come to a screeching halt. So faith is already baked into our economic system. What I'm saying is we need to shoot higher than just faith in the dollar. We need to start with faith in God, faith in neighbor, faith in each other, and faith in the future. And faith in the future is what hope is. And people are cynical today. They've lost faith in the future because they've tested our institutions and they have found them to be hypocritical. And so they've lost that hope for the future. And what happens is you get a really kind of ugly discourse that we've observed recently where people just sort of go into their tribes and they bunker down and they stop communicating with each other. Well, if we don't talk to each other, if we don't love each other, there will be no hope for the future. And that brings us, of course, to love. All of this is ultimately grounded in, rooted in love of neighbor, love of God. If we can bring love back into all of our economic endeavors, then we can redeem capitalism. And you know what? Here's the thing about virtue. Aquinas taught us, and now science has even taught us, that if you practice the virtues, you crave more virtue, and it becomes a virtuous cycle. And if you don't exercise virtues, then you begin to become numb to them, and you end up with the opposite, which is a vicious cycle of selfishness. So we can work our way out of this by practicing faith, hope, and love in economics.
Again, Dr. Kenneth Barnes with us today. And again, the book is entitled Redeeming Capitalism, published by Erdman's, about 230 pages. And Dr. Kenneth Barnes, thank you so very much for writing the book. Thank you for giving us an hour. And thank you for the teaching that you've done everywhere from Oxford to Gordon Conwell. It's just been a delight to have you on the program and love to do it again sometime.
My pleasure. Thank you, and thank you for the question.
Again, this is a book that I think you will find very helpful to begin to say, all right, we recognize we have some problems with especially what he refers to as postmodern capitalism, and capitalism that is almost red in tooth and claw, and one that is selfish and greedy and certainly sometimes exploits the poor. How can we as Christians redeem capitalism? Is there an answer to that? And this is a book that is an attempt to try to pull that together. And I hope that you'll take the time to find out a little bit more about him and about his book. And we have links that would allow you to do so by going to our website, pointofview.net. So take the time to go there. As you go there, you'll find some of the viewpoints commentaries that I've posted over these years on economics. So you could also use a search engine to find a couple of other things that might be of answer to you as well. Let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover.
We're telling you you can't pray in your own home. That happened not too long ago to Mary Ann Souse in Kansas. And in 2017, the U.S. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the officer. But this year, thanks to an investment of $1, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that ruling. Okay, let me explain. Over the years, listeners to Point of View have made a big difference. Some have become congressmen. Others have saved lives through helping women in crisis pregnancies. Others have become constitutional attorneys, like Kelly Shackelford, who represented Mary Ann Souse. We recently discovered it costs about $1 to reach a Point of View listener on the radio and online for an entire year. You can't buy much for $1 these days, but you can transform the nation. Call today and invest in Point of View at 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net, because $1 really can go a long, long way. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I've recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Our topic this hour is ethics, in particular Christian ethics, and that is the title of this new book, which is really a companion to the best-selling book Systematic Theology by Dr. Wayne Grudem. This one entitled Christian Ethics: An Introduction to Biblical Moral Reasoning. Wayne Grudem has been on the program with us many times before, a graduate of Harvard, University of Cambridge, Westminster Theological Seminary, has been the research professor of theology and biblical studies at Phoenix Seminary for many years, also perhaps well known as the general editor of the ESV Study Bible, and former president of the Evangelical Theological Society, co-founder and former president of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And Dr. Wayne Grudem, always a delight to have you on the program with us.
Thank you, Kerby. Good to be with you.
Let's, if we can, for just a minute, talk about your health, because I know many people are aware of your diagnosis of Parkinson's and others. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you're doing?
Yes, I'd be happy to, Kerby. I have great thankfulness to the Lord that the Parkinson's symptoms are still quite mild, and this is 2.5 years after my diagnosis. I tell people I think of it as a minor inconvenience rather than a major disability at this point. Now, Parkinson's is a progressive neurological disease, and what I've been told is it differs from one patient to another, and it's really impossible to predict the future course that it will take. But my doctor, neurologist, says that it looks to her that the disease in my case is progressing very slowly. And that was the last appointment I had with her. So I'm thanking God for that, and thankful for all the people who have prayed for me in that regard.
Well, again, we have a link to your website, waynegrudem.com, so people can find out more about your health and about you. This book, published by Crossway, 1,300 pages, and again, I described it as a companion resource to your best-selling book, Systematic Theology. Wouldn't you think that in some respects this is kind of like a 2-volume set? How does that fit together?
Well, that's fair, Kerby. It's different topics, but it's the same size of book, the same layout, the same approach to each topic, and that is I'm looking at what does the whole Bible say about various questions concerning how to live the Christian life. In the theology book, we talked about the atonement and justification and the Trinity and the deity of Christ, theological topics. Here we're talking about abortion, euthanasia, lying, telling the truth, stewardship of money, war, capital punishment, homosexuality, marriage and divorce, wealth and poverty. Those are ethical topics. How do we approach living the Christian life? So in a sense, it's a companion, but they cover two different areas of study.
And you talk about the layout. Let's talk about that for just a minute, because having written a book on Christian ethics and having read many others, this one I think is somewhat unique in that you take kind of like the 10 Commandments and have a section here on protecting God's honor. You shall have no gods before me, and you shall not make yourself a graven image. And so anything having to do with protecting God's honor. And then you have one on protecting human authority, honor your father and mother, and that gets into parents and marriage and those kinds of things. Then a section on protecting human life, you should not murder, which gets us into all sorts of issues like abortion, war, self-defense, euthanasia, and all those. Then protecting marriage, as well as then, of course, one on protecting poverty, you shall not steal, and protecting purity of heart, you shall not covet. So I thought that was a very interesting and a very unique way of pulling together all these very diverse ethical issues that we address here on Point of View that you've written about over the years in a format that begins to model what we find there in the Old Testament and in particular in the Ten Commandments.
Yes, but I have to confess now, Kerby, it's not original with me. This arrangement of ethical topics goes back at least to 1559 in Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, and it's in the Westminster Larger Catechism in the mid-1600s as well, and in other treatments of ethics. So I'm sort of depending on the wonderful work of many scholars of Scripture who have gone in generations previous to me.
Well, again, just very well done, and just a compendium of all sorts of issues. Let's get into the introduction for just a minute. A lot of times when I ask people, how do we determine right or wrong, they say the Bible, but you're very wise in saying, really, the ultimate basis for ethics is the moral character of God. Because even if we did not have the Bible, and aren't we glad that we do, even if we just know the character of God, then we know what is right and what is wrong, don't we?
Well, that's true, because God, in many cases in Scripture, tells us to imitate Him. We love because He first loved us. Be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. Why are we to be just and fair? Because God is a God of justice. Why are we to tell the truth? Because God is a God who cannot lie. Why are we to be faithful in marriage and in other commitments? Because God is faithful in all of His commitments. So again and again, if we trace back the origin, we find out moral commands from God in Scripture, but if we trace back and say, where did Scripture get these moral commands? Well, they flowed from they're God's words, which flowed ultimately from His moral character. And then if we reflect on the fact that God delights in His moral character because it is supremely good and it's unchanging and eternal, then we realize that His moral standards for human beings flow from His moral character, and so they apply to all people, for all cultures, and all of history. And that's why the Apostle Paul, for instance, in Acts 17 in Athens, could say to these Greek philosophers, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now He commands all people everywhere to repent. These weren't Jewish listeners, they weren't Christian listeners, they were Greek philosophers, pagans from a biblical point of view. But he says God commands all people everywhere to repent, because He has fixed a day on which He will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom He has appointed. And of this He has given evidence by raising Him from the dead. So he's right off the bat in his introduction to these Greek philosophers, he's saying Jesus Christ is going to be the judge of all, and there's going to be a final judgment, and you're accountable to God for your life. And that's because God is the source of ultimate moral standards in the universe. That's a powerful idea.
Oh, it certainly is. And again, the ultimate basis for ethics is, of course, the moral character of God. Then you go on to talk about the source of our ethical standards, no doubt, is the Bible. The goal of ethics is living for the glory of God. And then a whole section on the joys and blessings of obedience to God and the harmful consequences of sin. And even the whole issue of how to know God's will, factors to consider in making ethical decisions. And even a section, for example, on how should Christians use the Old Testament for ethical guidelines and guidance since we live in the New Testament. So when we come back, I wanted to spend some time looking at a couple of the sections. There's no way that we can cover a book that has 1,300 pages in 1 hour, but I thought we might focus on protecting human authority, the idea of the authority of parents and of government. Then we'll get into the contentious issues, for example, of human life. That's abortion, euthanasia, genetic engineering, and aging and death and dying and war and self-defense. Then we'll get into the issue of marriage and the redefinition of marriage that has taken place because of things like divorce and homosexuality, even transgenderism. And before we're done, it wouldn't be a good discussion with Wayne Grudem where we wouldn't talk a little bit about how ethics applies to economics. We're going to talk about protecting poverty and wealth and borrowing and lending and even the whole idea of protecting the purity of heart. So there's just a lot to cover. We won't even begin to scratch the very tip of it, but we'll do our best to give you an understanding of Christian ethics right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The public debate about transgender students using restrooms and showers became more intense in a small town in Oregon. I've actually preached in a church in this town and can imagine the reaction of the parents. A district judge ruled that a girl who identifies as a boy can use the boy's facilities and vice versa. The judge did offer an alternative. Parents can take their children out of the schools. Well, thank you. These parents pay taxes to support the school, but if they don't like the judge's ruling, they can take their kids somewhere else. Some of the statements in the ruling are extraordinary. The judge argued once the parents have chosen to send their children to school, their liberty interest in their children's education is severely diminished. That sure sounds like he believes that the state really owns the children, not the parents. He also rejected the idea that these students in the public school had any privacy rights. In the past, judges have often used the 14th Amendment to justify finding a privacy right within the Constitution. In this case, the judge in Oregon came to the opposite conclusion. He said that students have no fundamental privacy right to not share school restrooms, lockers, and showers with transgender students. This case is the opposite of the type usually cited. Parents have usually been concerned about the possibility of a boy who identifies as a female wanting to use the girls' showers and restrooms. In this case, it is a girl identifying as a male who wants to shower with the boys. After all, what could possibly go wrong with a naked girl taking a shower with a bunch of naked teenage boys? I think the judge's alternative is prophetic. Yes, parents can take their kids out of the public schools, and I expect more and more of them to do so because of such outrageous judicial rulings. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today with Dr. Wayne Grudem, and again, the book that we're talking about, Christian Ethics, An Introduction to Biblical Moral Reasoning. One of the sections deals with protecting human authority. And Dr. Grudem, for just a minute, let's talk about the authority of parents. And in that chapter, you talk about why does God want children to honor their parents, about family authority, even the whole idea of the advantages of public schools, Christian schools, home schools. This is an important issue because, first of all, if you do not learn to obey those in authority over you, your parents, you may never learn to obey those in authority in the government, and you're going to pay for certain consequences. And we also have a secular society that sort of implies that the children are really the wards of the state and the parents really have no responsibility over them. So how do we think through some of these issues?
Well, Kerby, first of all, thank you for what you said about us so effectively summarizing my book in a more effective and clear way than I could do in about 2 minutes. You did an amazing job. But as far as parents, yes, in the Ten Commandments, we have honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord your God gives to you. This is where God defines the basis of obedience and authority in the human family, but also respect and honor for parents. And it does place the primary responsibility for raising children with the parents. There's no thought in the Old Testament that some kind of government agency should be responsible for raising parents or had authority for raising children or had authority for raising children. But you are correct. The breakdown of much civility and respect and politeness and courtesy in society has I think, a lot to do with the fact that there's been a breakdown in parental authority and respect for that, which God's Word tells us is something that should be avoided. So we get that over in the New Testament. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord, Colossians 3:20. And Ephesians 6 says something similar. So it's important to protect the authority of parents. It's a foundational building block of all society.
You know, the other part of that you talk about is not only the authority of parents, but I was also talking about the authority of civil government. First of all, let me just commend to any of our listeners that don't have a copy of your previous book, Politics, According to the Bible, a comprehensive resource for understanding modern political issues in light of Scripture. That is a book on my shelf and one that I've referred to because you have a whole chapter here as well on civil government. Why did God establish civil government? What should government do? Whether there's ever a time when we disobey government. But I see these together because these are sort of like law spheres. You know, I guess we're going back to Calvin again. The idea that, you know, God has instituted the family and the church and the government. And really, if you don't have a civil order within the family, then you better have civil order within the government. And if you don't learn how to obey your parents, you may never learn how to obey the government. And yet in Romans 13:1-7, we are to obey government because it was instituted by God.
That's right. In fact, it's interesting, Kerby, just this morning I was in my own private reading of the Bible, I was reading Romans 13. And it not only says that the government that exists has been instituted by God, but then it says in Romans 13:2, therefore whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. I immediately thought of the resistance movement opposing, there's nothing wrong with having a different political viewpoint and advocating it fairly in the political sphere, but if people just try to throw sand in the gears of government and try to make it grind to a halt so it can't function at all, that's resisting the authorities, and Romans 13:2 says, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. I think that's a warning that we need to be careful to obey today.
Well, and again, that kind of also goes into the next section, because when you talk about Romans 13, it talks about government does not bear the sword for nothing. So that brings us into, is there ever a place for the government to protect us from foreign invaders? Of course so. Is there ever a place for government to enforce borders? Of course. Is there ever a place for government to exact punishment against evildoers? Yes. And so that kind of brings us into the issue of war. Is there ever a place for individuals to use self-defense? Kind of how do we think through that? Because that's been a big issue on the issue of borders, on the issue of obeying government, on the issue of self-defense. What's the proper role for government? What's our role in terms of protecting our families and ourselves?
Well, I go back to Romans 13 to start, and that is that Paul says rulers or government authorities are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. And then he is God's servant for your good, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, I think this passage views civil government as a gift from God, something we should be thankful for, and gives government the authority to execute retributive justice on those who do wrong, even to the point of capital punishment. Both because Romans 13 has the government bearing the sword. The sword was an instrument of execution. And because I talk about Genesis 9 and after the flood when God gave commands to Noah, including the command, whoever sheds the blood of man by man shall his blood be shed. So we have capital punishment as the basic, the most fundamental, most severe penalty that government can provide. And that is for the purpose of protecting human beings from those who would do them wrong and harm them. Yes, government should protect us from invaders from without, because that's part of rewarding good and punishing evil. But also, I think almost everyone would agree that the police force is necessary to protect us from thieves or murderers who would attack us otherwise if there wasn't a functional government. Now, the question is, what if you're attacked or someone in your family is attacked by someone who is high on drugs and irrational, is it right to use? Is it right to attempt to defend yourself or defend others? I do believe it is. Certainly, in the Old Testament, there were provisions for lesser penalty or no penalty if someone is breaking into your house at night and you intervene and the person dies. If it's during the daytime, then there's a punishment. But the point is, there was an expectation that people had a right to defend themselves. There's also an expectation that if a woman is out in a field and screams for help, that someone should come to help her to rescue her from an assailant. So I think that protection of others, even of ourselves, is not left entirely to government, but also is there's a right of self-defense and a necessity of self-defense. I point out that even after Jesus' disciples had been with him for 3 years, they were still carrying swords. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And swords were used for self-defense in the first century. And Jesus did not forbid his disciples from carrying a weapon for self-defense. I talk about this passage in Matthew 5 about turning the other cheek, and I believe it tells us not to hit back when someone slaps us as an insult. But I don't believe it prohibits us from escaping or even defending ourselves against a violent attack that would do us bodily harm or even kill us.
Let's see if we can take a break. And let me just mention in that section, of course, there are also things about, as we mentioned, capital punishment and war and self-defense. Also, we won't get into this because we've probably spent a fair amount of time talking about things like abortion and euthanasia and suicide and even issues of drugs and alcohol and all the rest. But those are some topics that are in there as well. But I'd be remiss, especially since we're having an opportunity to talk today with Dr. Wayne Grudem, who was one of the co-founders and a former president of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, if we wouldn't spend just a little bit of time talking about marriage. So when we come back from the break, we're going to look at marriage and then also some things related to it, everything from infertility and reproductive technologies and things like that, and then things which are harmful to marriage. And we have chapters there on everything from pornography to divorce and remarriage, the issue of homosexuality, transgenderism, and much more. And so we'll focus some time and attention on that. And then a little bit later, we'll also get into how applying maybe some of these ethical principles to areas like work and property and wealth and even the whole issue of poverty and financial stewardship and those kinds of issues will be another topic we will address as well. As I've mentioned, about 1,300 pages in this new book. It is published by Crosswise, and it is entitled Christian Ethics, An Introduction to Biblical Moral Reasoning. Dr. Wayne Grudem with us, and we'll take a break. And if you'd like to know more about him, we have a link to his website. If you'd like to know more about this book, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a link there as well so that you can order it and benefit from his seminal work in this area. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after these messages.
Just over 100 years ago, 2 or 3 cents would buy you what it takes $1 to buy today. What of any real value can you buy for a buck? Well, how about this? How about enabling one listener to hear point of view not just today, but for an entire year? You heard right. $1 makes it possible to reach a person through the radio or through any of our online channels for a year and pays for all the other resources available through our website. All the interviews with special guests and public officials, all the information, all the training, all the inspiration and transformation for $1. How many dollars will you invest in the future of our nation? How many lives can you change with your investment today? Call right now and reach more people to help change our nation. 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net, because $1 really can go a long, long way. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue your conversation today with Dr. Wayne Grudem. And again, this book on Christian ethics is certainly one that I would commend to you, An Introduction to Biblical Moral Reasoning. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to get the book either in print or in Kindle, we have a link on our website. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've certainly made it available to you as well. And those of you that would like to have that book with you all the time, since it is a fairly heavy book and lots of content, maybe you'd like to get the electronic version so you could carry it around with you in your laptop computer and certainly have that as a resource. Any young person going off to college that is really wanting to begin to apply biblical principles to not only the student areas and the academic areas that they're studying, but even their own personal life would benefit from this. And so, again, I just commend Dr. Grudem for pulling that together. And as I mentioned, a former president of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood has done quite a bit of writing over the years on that subject. And so, Wayne, if we could, for just a minute, let's focus on this issue of marriage. That's part 5 of your book, and the essential elements of marriage, but also, as we'll get into this in just a few minutes, how our secular society has sort of redefined marriage with cohabitation, with divorce and remarriage, and of course with homosexuality and transgenderism. But first of all, let's start with the biblical principles. What do we need to know about in terms of marriage, and how should we begin to apply those biblical principles to our married lives?
Well, the Bible views marriage not just as a human agreement, but as a covenant made before God. Malachi says God was witness to the covenant between you and the wife of your youth. And so I believe when marriage occurs, it's not only true that society views the man and woman differently, views them as married and not single, but God views them differently, views them as husband and wife and having privileges and responsibilities that are appropriate to marriage from that point on. I deal with the question of same-sex marriage and point out that nowhere in all of human history has any society given approval to same-sex marriage before 2001. Before 2001. And that was admitted by the lawyers arguing in favor of same-sex marriage before the United States Supreme Court. So we're now conducting an experiment, the likes of which has never been conducted in human history before, and I think it's going to have very destructive consequences in our society. But I also point out the positive fact that the statistics saying that Christians get divorced as often as non-Christians and 50% of marriages are going to head for divorce, those are extremely unreliable statistics. And I mentioned, I suppose it's true for you too, Kerby, and for all the listeners. It's simply not true. In my years of living as a Christian, Margaret and I have known really thousands of different Christian couples, and the number of couples who have gotten divorced out of all those hundreds and probably thousands that we've known is tiny. It's not anywhere near 50%, not near 25%. I don't even think it approaches 5%. And when you hear statistics that go counter to what your eyes tell you and your own life experience tells you, I think it's important to be suspicious of those statistics. And so I deal with that question a bit in this marriage chapter. Marriage is it's a legal union of man and woman as husband and wife, but as I say, also a covenant before God, and it's a relationship that pictures the relationship between Christ and the church. It was established by God in the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve are considered in Genesis 2 as husband and wife. And it's a beautiful institution, and Margaret and I just celebrated our 49th wedding anniversary, actually.
Well, let's, I'm very thankful for that. And let's, if we can, maybe then talk about, there are so many different attacks on marriage. We may not have time to get through all of those, but one of them, of course, as you mentioned, was the divorce statistics, but also just even today, this idea of living together, of cohabitation. You have young people that are saying, look, I wouldn't buy a car without a test drive. I wouldn't buy a pair of shoes without trying them on. And so as a result, what we're seeing is because individuals no longer hold to the sanctity of marriage and are willing to kind of experiment, whether it's infertility and adultery and cohabitation and homosexuality. There are just a lot of forces that are really affecting marriages today. So in some respects, you've really tried to address that, because couples that are infertile, they're struggling with their marriages. Couples that are convinced that they need to live together before marriage, they're struggling with it. The divorce rate has caused more of them to maybe not even want to get married. And so then add to that this whole emphasis on homosexuality and transgenderism. And these a couple of chapters in your book, these 6 chapters, really just remind us that marriage is under attack like never before.
It is, Kerby. One thing I point out in the book is that in older Bible translations, the word fornication was used quite often, and people understood that applied not only to adultery was committed by married persons, but also to sex between a man and a woman who weren't married to each other. And that occurs numerous times in the New Testament as something that is prohibited by God. But modern translations, and I'm part of the ESV Translation Oversight Committee, and I approve of and agree with this, that the word fornication is not exactly the best translation today. It seems like an archaic word to people. And we in the ESV Committee and many other modern translations have gone to the phrase sexual immorality. And the Greek word porneia did cover any kind of unlawful sexual intercourse, prostitution, unchastity, or fornication, that is sex outside of marriage between 2 unmarried people. But what happens is people read over these verses and say, flee from sexual immorality, 1 Corinthians 6:18, and they read right past that and don't realize that that certainly included in the first century a man and a woman having sex together before they were married. And so there are many, when we take the phrase sexual immorality, many passages in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, abstain from sexual immorality. So, yes, it's harmful to marriage, and statistics will show that. The most fulfilling and joyful sexual relationships are among couples who didn't have sex before they were married, didn't sleep together before they were married. And that's because following God's own directions and his own commands in Scripture is the way that we can know true happiness and joy.
Well, and again, when you talk about sex outside of God-ordained marriage, then, of course, that also includes the issue of homosexuality. And you even address the issues of, can a sex change surgery change a man into a woman? We're just in this whole kind of frontier now with homosexuality first and the legalization of same-sex marriage and now the pushing of transgenderism. It's just a different world that we're sending our seminary graduates out into than we were just a few decades ago, aren't we?
It really is. And, people think, well, if someone has a sex change operation, that means that someone who was previously a man is now a woman. Well, that's entirely false. Every cell in a man's body has an X and Y chromosome, except for red blood cells. And every cell in a woman's body has only 2 X chromosomes, except for red blood cells. And that means that a man who has a sex change operation and begins to claim that he's a woman still has 27 trillion male cells in his body. 27 trillion. Now, is he going to have 27 trillion operations to change those chromosomes? I doubt it. He's still a man. And that's why I would never refer to Bruce Jenner, for instance, who now wants to be called Caitlyn Jenner. I would never refer to him as a woman or as her or she. That would be a lie. He is still a man, even though he's attempting to portray himself as a woman. 27 trillion cells in his body, and all the thousands, tens of thousands or more ways in which his brain is wired to function differently from a woman's brain, and those are God-given and good differences, which contribute a lot to collective wisdom and joy in marriage. and there are many other differences that I point out. So it's impossible to change a man into a woman or a woman into a man. It's irrationality that's taken over our culture that tries to do this.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll conclude by looking a little bit at protecting property. And, of course, there's also a section on protecting purity of heart. But, again, I would be remiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time, first of all, talking with Wayne Grudem about the whole issue of marriage. And then, of course, more recently, over the last couple of years, has certainly written quite a bit on the issue of property and work and prosperity and poverty and wealth. And that is a section in this book as well, Christian Ethics, an Introduction to Biblical Moral Reasoning. We'll take a break and continue our conversation with him right after these messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Have you ever been concerned when you heard someone praying? Sandra McDonald was. She was the new site coordinator for Jenny Lind Elementary School and responsible for the after-school use of the school building by groups from the community. Child Evangelism Fellowship had a chapter of its Good News Club meeting at the school. McDonald happened by one day and was, quote, concerned about the religious content of the clubs after overhearing a prayer in reference to Jesus Christ during a meeting, unquote. Ultimately, the club was told that it would be removed from the after-school lineup of club offerings. It would still be able to meet, but the school would no longer provide the same transportation and food services that it provided for the Boy and Girl Scouts, Big Brother Big Sister, and other clubs meeting at the same time. Child Evangelism Fellowship challenged the decision, and in Child Evangelism Fellowship of Minnesota versus Minneapolis Special School District No. 1, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit concluded that the school had been unlawfully hostile to a religious club, but favorable to similarly situated secular clubs, when it should have been neutral toward all clubs. School districts should not be concerned when religious clubs act like religious clubs, and it violates the Constitution to treat them differently from other clubs. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Wayne Grudem with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Christian Ethics, an Introduction to Biblical Moral Reasoning. And we're going to get into this idea of protecting property. And if you've been following the career of Dr. Wayne Grudem or been listening to this program, you know a while back we had a chance to talk with him about a book that he co-authored on the poverty of nations, a sustainable solution, in which he got into economic issues. Of course, some of those are also in his previous book, which I mentioned here on politics. But in both of those cases, it is important, Dr. Grudem, to spend some time thinking about private property, about work, and about prosperity, And again, this is an area where I think up until recently has been neglected by some of your fellow Christian theologians, where they say, well, economics, politics, well, that's for, you worldview guys, but we're just going to teach systematic theology, God talk. But the Bible has a lot to say about money, has a lot to say about work and wealth and poverty and all that. And I'm so grateful that you've included that in this particular book on Christian ethics.
Well, it is very important. It's an essential part of human life. When you think about it, the ownership of property distinguishes us from the animal kingdom and sets us above the animal kingdom, shows one of the remarkable aspects of creation in the image of God. Ultimately, it's a faint imitation of God's ownership of the entire universe and his sovereignty over the universe. But the commandment, you shall not steal, implies the moral rightness of ownership of property. I shouldn't steal your laptop computer or your car or your bicycle because it belongs to you. It doesn't belong to me. And there were protections for not moving the landmark, which would be stealing land from people in the Old Testament. So that's important because the ownership of property then allows us to exercise wise stewardship and to exercise creativity and to exercise care for others. It's a major part of our lives, and so I have an entire section on protecting property and related issues. But I think we should start out by viewing the ownership of private property as something good, something established by God, not something evil. And, of course, Karl Marx was opposed to private property. He said the essence of communism may be summed up in a single sentence: the abolition of private property. But that's a horribly dehumanizing system, because ownership of property and stewardship of property is one of the ways in which we can exercise responsible stewardship and manifest more of the characteristics of our creation in the image of God for his glory.
Well, and also you've talked about, and of course we've documented this in other ways and in other interviews, how we, because of the free enterprise system, because of capitalism, have raised millions and now probably even closer to billions of individuals from extreme poverty. So,
right.
Again, the economic system, very important. But in the interest of time, I thought I'd also mention that this section on property also has a section on business ethics, which also brings me to one other Wayne Grudem book I might recommend, Business for the Glory of God, the Bible's Teaching on the Moral Goodness of Business. I'm doing a pretty good job promoting all your books. And if nothing else, because I've read them all, I know kind of how all of these books have come together into this one book, right?
That's, Kerby, there's some truth in that. The work I did on the book Politics According to the Bible gave me a deeper understanding of what government is about and why God established it and what it's supposed to do. The book I co-authored with my friend Barry Asmus, the book called The Poverty of Nations, A Sustainable Solution, gave me much deeper understanding of economics and how the economic system operates. And the book that I co-edited with John Piper, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, gave me much more understanding of male-female interactions within marriage. And the Business for the Glory of God is reflected in this chapter on business ethics, but it goes into more depth. So yes, in a way, this book, Christian Ethics, is a culmination of not only teaching that I've done for now 41 years in the college and seminary classroom, but also the previous research and writing that I've done on a number of these related topics.
Yeah, and again, last chapter on the purity of heart, and you had in a previous section had pornography. I could have put it under there, but also the purity of heart. But what you've tried to do throughout this book is really pull together all sorts of very different topics that we talk about so often here on Point of View. Put it together in a category based on the Ten Commandments, very similar to Calvin's Institutes, no doubt, and is just a great resource. But before we go, I thought for just a minute we might talk about some of the resources that are available on your website, and it's WayneGrudem.com. You don't even have to know how to spell his name because we have a link there as well, but you feature a number of books, but you also have all sorts of videos and then question and answer formats. So for just a minute, talk about some of the resources that are available at your website, WayneGrudem.com.
Well, Kerby, one of the things there is a collection of audio recordings of an adult Bible class that I taught for 12 years at Scottsdale Bible Church here in Arizona. And that includes the entire range of topics in systematic theology covered in my book, Systematic Theology. And then from 2011 to 2014, I taught on Christian ethics in that adult class. And those audio lectures are available for free for anyone who wants to download and listen to them. They cover the topics that are covered in this Christian ethics book. I have to say, when you teach an adult class that has between 170 and 200 wise, mature, thoughtful Christian adults, it's a challenging task. And my understanding of these topics in ethics was immensely helped by the interaction that I had with members of that class for those 12 years and for the 3 years that I taught on Christian ethics. So that's on the website. There's some videos of places that I've spoken. I've written about a page, between a paragraph and a page, about each one of the books I've published so people can get an understanding of what those books are. And there's a section that shows where people can obtain translations of especially my systematic theology into other languages. I'm not sure what else, Kerby. What am I missing?
Well, you've done very well, because I'd forgotten about that, but that's very helpful as well. If some people want to study systematic theology, but maybe they have a ministry with people that maybe speak Spanish or Korean or Arabic or French or whatever it might be, it's just amazing how many various languages that's been in there. And then, of course, you have books that have been strongly influential to you, books that you'd recommend for a Christian view on economics and all sorts of other things, even issues related to creation evolution. I like this one. Theistic evolution denies 12 creation events and undermines crucial doctrines. And so, again, I appreciate your worldview emphasis, the idea that even though, of course, you are known for being the general editor of the ESV Study Bible and you're known for systematic theology, you've gotten outside of the discipline or actually recaptured what used to be there, because I'll tell you, when you read Aquinas' Summa Theologica or Calvin's Institutes, you recognize that back then theology was a lot broader than the way theology is taught today. So I appreciate the fact that you've been willing to do that and to write so many of these great books. And this book, one last time, is available in your local bookstore, but we also have a way in which you could put it on your computer through Kindle or get a copy, and it's on our website, pointofview.net, Christian Ethics, an Introduction to Biblical Moral Reasoning. And Dr. Wayne Grudem, it is always a delight to have you on the program. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kerby. Good to be with you.
That's all we have for today, and I hope that you will find that interesting and helpful. We have a link to the WayneGrudem.com website, and all of it is available on our Point of View website. Don't forget that if you say, well, I'm certainly wanting to read his book, but do you ever address some of these ethical issues? Well, of course we do. And you can go to the Viewpoints commentary and sign up and receive those on a regular basis. You can use a search engine to find past ones. You can also type in key words or key individuals to find previous interviews we've done. It's all available at our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank
officer telling you can't pray in your own home. That happened not too long ago to Mary Ann Souse in Kansas. And in 2017, the U.S. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the officer. But this year, thanks to an investment of $1, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that ruling. Okay, let me explain. Over the years, listeners to Point of View have made a big difference. Some have become congressmen. Others have saved lives through helping women in crisis pregnancies. Others have become constitutional attorneys, like Kelly Shackelford, who represented Mary Ann Souse. We recently discovered it costs about $1 to reach a Point of View listener on the radio and online for an entire year. You can't buy much for $1 these days, but you can transform the nation. Call today and invest in Point of View at 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net, because $1 really can go a long, long way. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.